Hello, and welcome to the Michigan Department of Education's Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series. I'm Renee Garcia, the Director of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. As a department, we value rich and diverse history of our country and the world. We are proud to work with the institutions of higher education, cultural centers, and the Confederation of Michigan Tribal Education Directors to assist educators with teaching and learning about comprehensive history. Today, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Jason Young as our presenter. Dr. Young is an associate professor of history at the University of Michigan. The presentation you will experience today explores the crucial relationships between art and history in African American life and culture. We will learn more about how African Americans used art to express political and social ideas such as race, slavery, and freedom.
Thank you, Dr. Garcia, and good afternoon, all. Thank you for joining us. My name is Scott Koenig, and I'm a social studies consultant with the Michigan Department of Education. We are thrilled to have all of you in attendance as we continue the Comprehensive History webinar series. Your interpreter for today is Mr. Nick Miller. The TCH webinars are intended to lift the knowledge of educators so that in turn you may provide opportunities for your students to inquire, think critically, and explore history from multiple perspectives you may have not heard before. As you listen today, you are invited to explore these opportunities to take new learning, insights, and ideas to your communities. Dr. Jason Young is an associate professor of history at the University of Michigan. He teaches and researches in the fields of 19th-century United States history, African American history, and the African Diaspora. Dr. Young is the author of Rituals of Resistance, African Atlantic Religion in Kongo and Lowcountry region of the Georgia and South Carolina in the era of slavery, and co-editor with Edward Blum of the Souls of W.E.B. Du Bois, New Essays and Reflections. He is also the co-curator of Hear Me Now, The Black Potters of Old Edgefield, South Carolina, which will be on view at the High Museum in Atlanta through May 2024. Dr. Young has published articles in the Journal of African American History, the Journal of Africana Religions, and the Journal of Southern Religion, among others. He is currently conducting research toward his next book project, To Make the Slave Anew, Art, History, and the Politics of Authenticity. Welcome, Dr. Young.
It's so good to be here. I'm very much looking forward to the session and to spending this hour with you. I'm hoping to provide over the course of this hour some material that is both familiar and unfamiliar to you. I suspect that some of the people who we are discussing and some of the events that I mentioned today will be things that you may already be integrating into your classrooms. And I'm hoping to do that in such a way that provides you a little bit of a different way to think about it, or a different way to look at some of the material that you have already been using. And I'm hoping that perhaps I can surprise you along the way by providing you with some access to information and resources that may be new to you. So I'm more than happy to be here, and I'm excited to jump in. If we move to the next slide, we'll get a sense of the lay of the land for it today. We'll start today talking a little bit about tangible histories and about ways that we can encourage our students and really ourselves to think about the physical remnants and legacy of American history, and in particular today, the kind of physical remnants and legacies of American slavery. We'll turn from that conversation to a consideration of different kinds of writing and literacy that happened in the antebellum period, and different ways that enslaved people effectively wrote their experiences, not always on paper, but in ways that are deeply significant and that are resonant with us today. And then we'll end with a short consideration of embodiment, thinking about what bodies and work mean in a larger consideration of the American slave past. So if we can move to the next slide. So I'm an historian. All of my degrees, undergrad through PhD, are all in history. I love the field of history. It is a beautiful, wonderful, and at times frustrating field of inquiry. I am always finding myself as an historian on the path of the lives and experiences and cultures of enslaved people. Much of that search for me involves literary sources. It involves documents. Many of these documents are fugitive documents. In fact, most of the documents that I use to try to reconstruct the lives of African Americans are documents that weren't created by African Americans themselves, that they didn't intend initially to document the lives of African Americans. In fact, I often have to read documents against the grain of their own intent in order to get some sense of what Black life was like in the antebellum period. For this reason, I am always eager and interested and excited when I'm able to identify a three-dimensional, tangible aspect of African American history or the history of American slavery. I'm showing you one example here. What you see here is a slave pen. It was a structure that was used to house enslaved Africans as they were being moved from one place to another in the Deep South. That pen was first constructed in the 1800s. As I mentioned, it was first constructed in Kentucky. It has since been removed from its original site and placed in the National Underground Freedom Center in Cincinnati, Ohio. I don't know if any of you have had a chance to visit the Freedom Center in Cincinnati, Ohio. It's a beautiful, beautiful structure. And it faces south, looking over the Ohio River into the state of Kentucky. And it was that pathway that many enslaved people took as they sought to capture their own freedom. They would travel from Kentucky, cross over the Ohio River. If they could find themselves in Cincinnati, then they could enjoy some peace of freedom. And the National Underground Freedom Center is positioned just there, right on the banks of the Ohio River, as a kind of symbolic welcoming site for people who are interested in the history of the Underground Railroad. And this building, this slave pen, is one of the central objects of attraction at that center. It takes up room in a cavernous exhibition gallery space. And it is the place that people go to visit and spend time when they're thinking about communing with the slave past. If we go to the next slide, we'll see another example of this building. This is what the building looked like in situ in Kentucky. This is before the structure was deconstructed, brought to Cincinnati, and then reconstructed as a part of the National Underground Freedom Center. This popularity of having access to a kind of tangible history is particularly poignant for people interested in African American history. As we know, much of the material that enslaved Africans produced was consumed at the point of production. The tobacco was smoked, the sugar was sipped with tea, the cotton was worn bare, even the indigo has since faded. And so to the extent that we have some objects, some remnants, some physical legacy of the slave past, it's very rare, but when we have those things, we often find that they're really popular and they become sites of communion and connection between the present and the past. Next slide, please. As Scott mentioned, I am co-curator with partners at the Met Museum at New York and the Museum of Fine Arts Boston. I'm co-curator of a show called Hear Me Now, The Black Potters of Old Edgefield, South Carolina. Next slide, please. One of the things that this show provides for us is an opportunity to engage directly with some of the physical legacy of the slave past. As you can see, the show opened at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. It traveled to the Museum of Fine Arts Boston. It was here at the University of Michigan Museum of Art and just recently left in early January, and it's now in Atlanta at the High Museum. And it offers one of the rare few opportunities to have a kind of tangible relationship with part of the legacy of the slave Passed. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, we often imagine, as is true, that the vast majority of enslaved people were engaged in either agricultural or domestic pursuits in the United States. That's certainly true. The vast majority of people who found themselves enslaved were working in the fields or in domestic service as maids or cooks or butlers or drivers. But what I'd like to talk about today is another aspect of incredibly important slave-produced material that was just as essential to the operation of the Southern plantation as was the cotton field or the indigo or the sugar or the tobacco. As many of you know, in the antebellum period, just about anything that you ate from or sipped from, any vessel that you used to store liquids or to store food would have been made by clay. It would have been ceramic material. For most of the antebellum period, this is a time before glass becomes widely available as a consumer product. So the kind of ball jars that some of our grandmothers might have used to can and preserve foods, those jars don't really become widely available as consumer products until later in the 19th century. I don't have to tell you, but I do sometimes have to tell my students that this is a time before plastics are available to store food and to eat from or sip from. And so the vast majority of things that you would need for the operation of a plantation, for food service, for food storage, for the storage of liquids and things of that nature, that it has to be produced. And it's produced largely through ceramics. And it was, in the case that we're going to talk about today, it was potteries in and around Edgefield, South Carolina, where much of the material that was used on plantations around the Deep South, much of that ceramic material was produced in this area. Edgefield is a relatively small town. It's on the western edge of the state. It's very far from the central hub of Charleston. It's not the state capital like Columbia. It's a relatively small place, but it plays an absolutely outsized role in the plantation management and operations throughout the South. And it was enslaved men and women who were producing much of this ceramic ware, much of this pottery. I don't have any other way to describe the scale and scope of this pottery production except to say that it was industrial in nature. We often think of the emergence of American industrialization, the period of American industrialization, as a northern phenomenon. Our minds often go to New England, to textile manufactories, to factories in and around the Atlantic coast when we imagine what American industrialization looked like in the 19th century. But the North was not the only site of American industrialization. There was industrial level production happening even in the slave South. So in some ways, this idea that we have of a kind of agricultural South and industrial North, it's not quite the full story. In fact, there was industrial level production happening in the South. And this is one of the places where you see some of that industrial production. And you'll see in this slide a range of objects that enslaved people were producing. Over the course of our time together today, and certainly in subsequent talks, I'm going to talk widely about a range of the objects that you're seeing here, but we're going to focus before too long on one aspect of this production in particular. Next slide, please. One of the most impactful parts of this ceramic production, for me personally, is that this material is both incredibly durable. Many of these clay bodies that were produced in the antebellum period will outlive all of us. At the same time, these objects are also fragile. And so while some of the material that has emerged from Edgefield represents the fine, finished, perfect ceramic bodies, there are also shards that are, and I mean this in the most literal sense, that are merely a part of the landscape of Western South Carolina in the Edgefield region. There are massive amounts of this material. In some ways, in fact, the shards and the broken pieces give us even more information about what this industrial level production looked like than some of the finished, beautiful, fine pieces. Because when the pieces are broken, it allows us to veer inside the vessel. We get a sense of how these objects were made. When you look very closely, not only to the outside, but when you look closely inside these vessels, you can see fingerprints and maker's marks. On the vessel to the side, you can see, as you peer into the vessel, some of the coiling technologies that were used to bring some of these objects up. You'll notice on some of the objects on the right, there appears to be writing, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about some of the writing that you see etched on the sides of some of these vessels. Next slide, please. You also have objects like this. And here I want to just spend a little bit of time of thinking about how powerful a tangible connection to the slave past can be. What you're looking at is the bottom of a pot, a broken pot, that came out of one of these Edgefield potteries during the antebellum period. What you see on the bottom of this pot is a handprint. And it seems that at some point, the maker of this pot had enough dirt or oil or detritus on their hands that when they picked the pot up, most likely picking it up from the area where it was being dried and putting it into the kiln, enough of that material from their hand was emblazoned on the bottom of the pot so that when it came out of the kiln, they had effectively imprinted this pot on the bottom. When I think about objects like this, I imagine that I can have an opportunity to reach my hand, attach it to this hand that's on the bottom of this pot, that I can move across geographies and across time periods, across decades and centuries, and commune with the person who made this pot in the first place. When I'm feeling really selfish, when I'm feeling really selfish, I imagine that the person who made this pot is also reaching out towards me, that this handprint is something of a signature, a message, an attempt to escape the drudgery of the life that this person led. And we are in some way meeting and communing somewhere in the middle space between the here and now and the there and then. This is a kind of connection to the slave past through a tangible object that is very difficult to have if you're only relying on literary sources. I don't mean to suggest, and in fact, we're going to talk a lot today about the power of literature and the power of literacy in the written word. We'll spend a good amount of time on that. And as an historian, I have a certain kind of romantic relationship with the archive and with the printed word. I admit that happily. But at the same time, there is something about the object, about the tangible, that does something that exceeds the page, that exceeds writing. And it's in these moments when we focus on these kinds of objects that I think we can offer new lessons, new lenses to see and understand the slave past. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, the area in and around Edgefield was producing ceramic material during the antebellum period on an industrial scale. What you're looking at here is what's called a waster pile. Now, many of you know that a percentage of what you produce when you're making ceramics, a percentage of what you produce just doesn't make it out of the kiln. A minor or fine problem with the clay body, a small crack can be exposed in the kiln. And when an object was placed in the kiln but just doesn't make it out, when it doesn't survive the firing, that material would be tossed into what's called waster piles. And this is an example of one of those waster piles. I have been on several site visits to Edgefield area potteries. And one of the things that is most remarkable to me about my own experience there is that just the landscape, the everyday landscape of Edgefield and surrounding areas is littered with this material. As you're walking along paths, along the side of the road, in public and private spaces, this material is everywhere to be found. It is in some ways a testament to just how much material was being produced during the antebellum period and how central Edgefield was to the plantation enterprise, not only in Edgefield, but really in the larger South. Next slide, please. If you look closely at some of these waster piles, or if you're lucky as you're walking through this area, you'll notice that some of these shards bear the name Dave, who has come to us now as, in some ways, the most important enslaved potter in the region. Dave was remarkable for a number of reasons. First, he was a master potter. Some of the large vessels, some of the large ceramic vessels that he was making, large storage pots for the preservation of meats or liquids, water that would be used on slave plantations. Some of the larger pots that he's throwing begin with as much as 80 or 90 pounds of raw clay that he then pulls up into these massive vessels. We'll see some examples of some of these vessels later on. I don't know if any of you have had any experience with ceramics or with throwing pots or with the wheel, but even a fistful size of clay is willful. It doesn't want to do what you want it to do. It doesn't even want to be a ball. It will be anything other than a ball when you have even just a fistful of clay on the wheel. It will move and change and escape. It's a fugitive kind of material. In order to pull a pot that starts with in excess of 90 pounds of clay, you need two things in equal measure that are really quite remarkable. An incredible amount of physical strength and dexterity, which Dave clearly had the ability to manage and manipulate these large amounts of clay. Absolutely need that. But another thing that you need is an incredibly fine hand to be able to pull up these delicate pots. Raw brute strength is not going to do it. You need also to have a kind of delicate hand. One of the things that is most remarkable about the pots that Dave was producing is that they bear the mark of both of those things. Real, raw physical strength, but also fine-tuned dexterity and subtle care of the materials. It's really quite remarkable to see these pots up close. Next slide, please. But for the fact that Dave was a master potter and he was able to pull up these incredibly important, really large pots with skill and dexterity. But for that alone, his reputation would have been well-deserved in and around Edgefield. And in fact, Dave pots were known throughout the region as incredibly masterful pots. And slave owners from the region would often ask for, buy and sell a Dave pot. It was widely known what a Dave pot was. And these pots would often be commissioned by potters in the area. So the pot itself is worth Dave's reputation as a master potter. But it's not just that. Dave is also literate. He's literate at a time in South Carolina where not only is it illegal for enslaved African Americans to know how to read, it's illegal for whites to teach Black people how to read. And yet he develops literacy. We don't know exactly how he developed literacy. There are some theories about how he learned to read. I'm more than happy to talk about that in a question and answer period. We do have some theories about how he became literate. It's not just that he is a literate slave who's making these master pots. He signs his name to these pots. It's not just that he signs his name to the pots, he dates many of the pots that he produces. I want to say one thing about his signature. Again, this is something that I don't have to tell you, but I often do have to explain this to my students. I actually had an argument just this morning with my students about whether or not they could read cursive. And they're quite frustrated by the fact that they can't read cursive for a number of reasons. That was an interesting conversation I had this morning. But one of the things that I do have to point out with my students is that in the 19th century, your hand, that is to say your handwriting, was incredibly important. Your class status could be identified in your hand. You could tell the hand of a wealthy or elite person. You could tell in the same way the handwriting of someone who had never received formal education. Not only that, but there are handwriting experts in the 19th century who convince readers that they can determine the inner character of an individual based on the nature of their handwriting. So that there are experts who say that they can read the character of the thief or the liar or the cheat just in the way that they write words, that in their handwriting, they reveal their kind of inner character. I am often amazed at how masterful Dave's hand is as he's etching on the side of these clay pots. It tells me for sure that clay was not the first medium in which he was writing, surely was writing on paper. We don't have any physical evidence of pages that he wrote, but I am all but convinced that he did not just learn how to write on clay pots. He has a masterful hand that he certainly would have practiced on paper first before applying it to these clay bodies. But it's not just that Dave is literate, that he's signing his name, that he's dating his pots. He's also including on the sides of his pots poetic couplets. He's including poetic couplets that tell about his own experience, the experience of other enslaved African Americans. Perhaps most remarkable, some of the couplets that he uses to sign his name actually show the evidence of resistance to slavery. We'll talk a bit about how he was able to engage in this kind of subtle act of resistance on the sides of pots through this, through his writing in just a moment. Next slide, please. Here you have two examples of Dave's poem pots. On the left, you see just a small cutout of the lip of one of the pots, and the full inscription reads, "When you fill this jar with pork or beef, Scott will be there to get a piece." And you'll notice the spelling of peace on the side of this pot. One of the things that Dave does is he's playful with language. And to imagine that this pot was used, this would have been the pot that's used to distribute weekly rations to the slave community. The idea that Scott is like always first in line to come get not just a piece of meat, P-I-E-C-E, but to get some sense of peace is really quite remarkable. And Dave often works and plays with language and spelling and punctuation in ways that is precisely consistent with what you see in the larger kind of literary worlds of 19th century literature and letters. And so in that way, I see Dave as a part of the larger field of 19th century American letters. I don't know any other way to say it. On the right, you get a sense of Dave as a person who's aware of his surroundings. He's aware of the people who are in his community, where they come from, how they're operating. We might imagine that enslaved people have very limited access to information about the world in which they live, and that's certainly true. I won't argue against that. But it's also clear that enslaved people are aware of the world around them in some really important and significant ways. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, this writerly tradition that Dave is engaged with is, to my mind, very much in line with the writerly tradition of African Americans who are operating in other areas of life. To the left, you see an example from Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. I will talk in a few minutes about some more rather remarkable connections between Harriet Jacobs' writing in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, and Dave's writing on some similar themes. To the upper right, of course, you see Frederick Douglass, and an example from Narrative of the Life, the famous slave narrative that he wrote. And to the bottom, you see Olaudah Equiano, one of the few enslaved Africans who was able to write about his own experience being captured in West Africa, experiencing the Middle Passage, and then living through a really quite remarkable life of freedom and slavery around the Americas. This writerly tradition is a key feature in the life, community, and culture of African Americans. And if much of the writerly tradition of African Americans is captured between the pages of these books, I just mean to suggest here, I just want to offer that some of the writerly tradition of African Americans is captured on the sides of these clay vessels, and that Dave is every much a part of the literary tradition of this larger African American community of writers and thinkers. Next slide, please. Here you see one of the famous lines from Frederick Douglass's narrative. You have seen how a man was made a slave. You shall now see how a slave was made man. One of the most crucial moments in Frederick Douglass's life that propelled him from slavery to freedom was his access to literacy. That he recognized very early on that access to literacy was going to be the gateway through which he would achieve freedom. And he talks very much about the way that he learned to read. And I'll talk a bit more about that in just a moment. But he talks a lot about his quest to become a literate person, and his quest to become a literate person and his quest to become a free person ran along these really closely parallel lines. He connected literacy to freedom in some really important ways. Next slide, please. One of the scenes in Frederick Douglass's narrative that is perhaps most remarkable to me is a scene that happens to him when he's relatively young. He's a relatively young boy. At this moment in his life, he's enslaved in Baltimore, Maryland, and he's working in the house and along the docks in Maryland. And Sophia Auld, the mistress of the house, has taken him in as a charge and has started to teach him the rudiments of education, started to teach him how to read. In the middle of one of his lessons, Hugh Auld, the slave owner and husband to Sophia, crashes through into the room, and he is absolutely apoplectic at the idea that Sophia Auld is teaching Frederick Douglass how to read. He goes into a long diatribe against his wife. The interesting part about the scene, as I try to recreate it in my mind, is that Hugh Auld is not angry with Frederick Douglass in this moment. He's angry with his wife. And so Frederick Douglass, as a young boy, is seeing the scene in which husband and wife are arguing with each other. And Hugh Auld says to Sophia that if you teach a slave to read, it will make him forever unfit to be a slave. Well, that idea was kind of interesting to Frederick Douglass. Wait a minute, if I learn to read, it will make me forever unfit to be a slave? That I won't be of value to my master if I learn how to read? And so Frederick Douglass, in this really fascinating scene in this narrative, is seeing two people argue, husband and wife, and Hugh Auld is, without knowing it, without knowing it at all, he's giving Frederick Douglass the blueprint to his own freedom. That if I can learn to read, then I will be unfit to be a slave. And then if I'm unfit to be a slave, then most certainly I will be free. I'll enjoy freedom. Now, as it happens, this argument spelled the end of Frederick Douglass's lessons with Sophia Auld. She stops teaching him how to read on the very stern admonitions of her husband, Hugh Auld. But it doesn't end Frederick Douglass's own quest to become literate. I'll just mention one little part of Frederick Douglass's own quest. As I mentioned, he was working in and around Baltimore, largely on docks. And one of the things that he would do in his quest to attain literacy is he would make sure when he left the house, he would have some goodie with him, a cookie or some sweet or a piece of meat or something. Make sure that he had some goodie with him as he walked out. And he would approach young white boys who are also kind of working in and around the dock region in Baltimore, and he would challenge them. He would say to them, I bet you this cookie, you can't write the word cat. And so they would scratch the word cat using a stick into the sand or the dirt. And Frederick Douglass would go home and memorize just the shape of those letters. The next day, he would come out with another treat. He would bet another one of the young boys that he didn't know how to spell a word, or he didn't know the alphabet, or he didn't know how to write a particular letter. And slowly and by degrees, Frederick Douglass started to teach himself how to read, really by tricking these young boys to teach him how to read. And all it cost him was a couple of cookies and some scraps of meat that he got from the kitchen at home. Next slide, please. In addition to helping enslaved people imagine a kind of route to freedom, another thing that literacy produced was the desire to resist the slave system in any way possible. In 1831, Nat Turner led a successful slave rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia. And just to take one small step back, Nat Turner had for all of his life been what members of the master class called a model slave. He had never been resistant. He had never been disobedient. He had been the kind of ideal enslaved person. Based on his high moral character and the fact that he had been a good slave, Nat Turner was taught to read. Not only was he taught to read, he was employed as something of an itinerant preacher. He would be sent from one plantation to another plantation, and the goal was that he was going to preach sermons of obedience and submission to the slave populations in neighboring plantations. This experience opened Nat Turner's eyes to the brutalities of slavery that were not only happening on his own home plantation, but that were happening throughout the region. When Nat Turner got access to the full Bible, the lesson that he received from it, increasingly and over time, was not a lesson about submission and obedience. More and more, he came to understand that there was a liberating lesson in the Bible. And he started to imagine himself as the Moses who could lead his people out of Egypt, out of slavery in Egypt. He started to imagine himself as a kind of Christ-like figure who could bring in a new era, a new day that's free of the whip and the relationships between master and slave. When he started to preach this new theology, and when he enacted it in the event of the slave rebellion in 1831, it absolutely surprised and confounded his owners and other members of the master class. This was Nat Turner. He had been a model slave his entire life, but somehow his access to literacy had, in the minds of whites living at the time, this access to literacy had somehow warped his brain and convinced him that he was due to be free or that there was a change coming. And so one of the things that happens is that Thomas Gray, who's an attorney, travels to the jail. Nat Turner he's led the slave rebellion. He's been captured. He was sentenced in court to be executed. And in the days leading up to his execution, Thomas Gray, an attorney, went in and just started to question Nat Turner about the path that he had taken from an obedient, submissive, ideal slave to a slave rebel. And so we have in the writings of Thomas Gray some access to Nat Turner's own thinking and to the way that he imagined and participated and manufactured the slave rebellion. Next slide, please. one of the key aspects of Nat Turner's understanding of his role in this coming rebellion, in this coming fight, is that he started to recognize a relationship between the prophecy that he was reading about in the Bible, and he started to read that prophecy to see evidence of it in the natural world. He started to see figures in the sky and on the ground and in the world around him as signs, signifiers that this new day was coming and that he was a key figure in this coming new day. Now, as it happens, he was largely right. The Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831 was a critical moment in the lead up to the Civil War. It galvanized Southern opposition to abolition. It helped to invigorate an increasingly progressive and resistant form of abolition in the North. I mean, he's not exactly wrong in his ability to read both in the scripture and in the natural world some special role for him in this coming change. Next slide, please. Neither was Nat Turner alone in this relationship of reading the scriptural text and applying it to the natural world that he is living in. Frederick Douglass, and there's a link to this that we can add to the chat. Frederick Douglass was one of the many. I hope you'll give me a chance just to nerd out a bit on this for a moment. I won't spend too much time, but I would like to nerd out on this for just a moment. Frederick Douglass was one of many people who witnessed in 1833 a massive meteor shower. It's called the Leonid shower, and as I mentioned before, we'll include a link in the chat. By every account, this meteor shower that happened in 1833 was a fantastic display in the sky. When I say I nerd out about this meteor shower in 1833 a bit, it's because there's a really interesting relationship between all of the people on the ground who were seeing this meteor shower at the same time. So, for example, Frederick Douglass witnessed this meteor shower. Joseph Smith of the Mormon Church was also on the ground seeing this meteor shower in 1833. And it was often perceived as a deeply, not just meaningful moment, but also one that's resonant with spiritual and religious significances. And when Frederick Douglass sees that meteor shower in 1833, his mind went immediately to a scripture in Mark that he had read, that the stars shall fall from heaven. And the falling of the stars from heaven was, in a scriptural sense, meant to be a kind of prophetic moment that would call a new day to become. And so when Frederick Douglass is relating his literacy and understanding of biblical scripture and then applying that to his everyday life, you can completely understand how this connection is made. Let me just say also, and briefly here, a few years ago, there was a solar eclipse. I'm in Ann Arbor, of course. A few years ago, what was it, 2017 or 18, I imagine, there was a solar eclipse here in the region. And as we might imagine, the university placed telescopes all on the grounds in the quad, and students came out and faculty, and we were all able to look up into the sky. We were not in Ann Arbor in what's called the path of totality. We didn't have a total solar eclipse. I think we reached something like 75 or 80% coverage of something of that nature. Now, I imagine that if pressed, I could probably give a fairly reasonable explanation of what a solar eclipse is and how it happens. If pressed, I think I could give a fairly reasonable explanation. But when I was out there during the solar eclipse, and we are again in the midst of another solar eclipse, and in fact, I'm very close to the path of totality. I think Toledo, Ohio is going to be within that path of 100% coverage in the coming solar eclipses just a few weeks from now. When I was witnessing the solar eclipse, again, this is someone who I think I had fair confidence that I could give a worthy explanation of what a solar eclipse is. I was myself surprised at how deeply resonant that experience was for me. on campus, in the quad, looking through a telescope. I have a full and complete understanding of what's happening in the sky, fairly full and complete understanding of what's happening in the sky. And yet, I was myself really touched by this moment in a way that exceeded the beauty of the event. It was a deeply resonant event, not just for me, but for many of the people who were witnessing it. And in that moment, my mind went immediately back to the experience of Frederick Douglass. What would it mean for enslaved people or for people who don't have a way to explain what's happening in that night sky or in that day sky? What does it mean for you to see a solar eclipse or a meteor shower? What kinds of mechanisms of explanation do you have for that moment? And how would you not experience it as deeply resonant spiritually or religiously in certain kinds of ways? And so when I read Frederick Douglass and the experience he had, I can imagine how deeply meaningful that moment was for him as well, but it was rooted in his literacy. Next slide, please. For all of these reasons, I read Dave as a part, again, of this long literary tradition that includes Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs and Olaudah Equiano and others. In one of the pots that Dave created, he wrote an incredibly poignant couplet. 19 days before Christmas Eve, lots of people after it's over, how they will grieve. Dave is writing in the beginning of December in anticipation of the coming holiday season. Now, what Dave knew and what many enslaved African Americans knew was that the relationship between enslaved people and the holiday season was vexed, to say the least. As many of you know, enslaved people could be bought and sold at any time of the calendar year. But January 1st was a particularly important day for the buying and selling of enslaved Africans, precisely because January 1st was what was known as hiring day. January 1st was the day that slave owners who had an excess of labor, they had too much labor, more labor than they needed for the coming year, would hire their enslaved laborers out to area plantations. And so people who needed labor in the upcoming year could in effect rent or lease labor. And people who had an excess of labor could rent or hire out that excess labor. People who are hired out on January 1st, at hiring day, have no reasonable expectation that they will ever see their loved ones again. Now, they might make it back after the period of that contract was over. Typically, those labor contracts extended from January 1st to December 31st. They were 1 year long. And so it could be that someone who's sent out to work on an area plantation or a regional plantation might come back the next year, but you can have no reasonable expectation that that person will come back. He could be sold away in the middle of that contract year. He could not survive the experience that he has in that contract year. Because January 1st was known widely as hiring day, this day of renting and leasing out labor, it was also the calendar day on which more African Americans were bought and sold than any other calendar day. Now, again, enslaved people can be bought and sold on any calendar day, but January 1st emerged as the day in principle, more than any other, that people are bought and sold. Next slide, please. Partly for that reason, Harriet Jacobs writes in a way that is poignant and painful about what New Year's Day means for enslaved people. That while the coming of the holiday season and the new year is a moment of great celebration for most everyone else, for enslaved people, the coming of the new year is frightful. And to my mind, it's not just that the coming of the new year comes with the knowledge that you'll be separated from your family members. The problem, in fact, is that the new year comes with the not knowing. It's not knowing whether or not your family will be separated this year. You know that families will be separated, but is this the year that the hammer is coming down on your family? Next slide, please. I'll end here with a slide that is both a summary of some of the things that we've been talking about, but also in some ways some prologue about what's going to come in the second session of this series. One of the most famous pots that Dave produces is this pot upon which he writes the couplet, "I wonder where's all my relations, friendship to all in every nation." Despite his mastery of the wheel and his popularity as a potter, Dave was not himself able to secure or protect his own family. At some point in the 1850s, his family was sold away from him to a plantation in Texas. And soon after that moment, he makes this pot and writes along the side of it, "I wonder where's all my relations, friendship to all in every nation." An incredibly poignant line that is both tragic, but at the same time, somehow hopeful for another future or another possibility. It is the expression of a wide open heart. In the next session of this series, I'm going to begin to answer that question about where Dave's relations are, to talk more broadly about what it means to live in a larger community of enslaved people. I'm happy to stop there. I know that we're coming on time. I'm happy to take as many questions are available as for which we have time available. But I'll toss it to you and let you lead from here.
Thanks, Dr. Young. Yeah, this is amazing. Like I'm just enthralled with what has come out of this content, and being this presentation that is connected to the visual, I think is just so powerful for a learner, and particularly for our younger student learners who get to jump into this space. We are running short on time, so I will have to conclude. And any questions that may be there, we will share them with Dr. Young and get back to those that asked the questions. So if that's okay with you, Dr. Young, we will.
Oh, absolutely, yes. Please do send them along. I'm more than happy.
Okay, yeah. Wonderful. And thank you. So thank you all. I appreciate your patience and I appreciate you joining us for today. And Dr. Young, for sharing your knowledge with us throughout this webinar. Your work is important to Michigan's educators and leaders as it truly supports how we may teach comprehensive history within our classrooms. We sincerely appreciate you creating this presentation in support of this important Michigan Department of Education effort. Thank you to the Teaching Comprehensive History team for their work in moving the Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series forward. Thank you to our attendees for listening and learning with our team throughout this season's webinars. Dr. Rice reminds us that as members of a diverse state, nation, and world, school staff and students need to know our rich, complex history. These powerful webinars, along with the provided resources, encourage Michigan educators and school leaders to deepen their knowledge so that they may share with their students. As searing as some of our history is, we have a responsibility to teach it all. We do ask the attendees to join us in future Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series, particularly the next series here. We will be returning on March 20th from 4 to 5 p.m. with Dr. Young to continue on with this learning experience and hear more, particularly about Dave. I'm really excited for that. We encourage attendees and educators to visit the Teaching Comprehensive History website to revisit past webinars and gain access to incredible resources for the future registration opportunities as well. Thank you all for joining us today and the work that you do for Michigan students. Please make sure to complete the survey for this event that will be emailed to you when you close out of the webinar. So again, thanks for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.